My name is Piyush Chaudhary and I am working as an assistant professor at the Department of English, Hansraj College, University of Delhi. Today I will be delivering a lecture on a short story by the renowned Indo-Canadian writer Rohinton Mistry. The story is titled Swimming Lessons, which was published first in 1987 under a collection of short stories titled Tales from Firozsha Baag. Now, Rohinton Mistry is, I can say with some amount of surety, that he is undoubtedly one of the contemporary giants in world literature at this moment. Mistry is known as a writer who portrays with great sensitivity the human struggles, the inner ramblings of his characters, and Mistry is basically a member writer of the Indian diaspora. The term diasporic writers, when we talk about the term diasporic writers, it is basically used to describe Indians living abroad and producing literature. And Mistry is a Parsi novelist and a short story writer currently based in Canada. Talking about his life, I'll be just very briefly describing about his life first, and then we'll go on to the summary of Rohinton Mistry's swimming lesson and then on to a critical analysis. So this will be a two-part lecture. So talking about his life, after he left Bombay, look at what Rohinton Mistry says, as you can see on the slide now. Rohinton Mistry in an interview said that I left Bombay for Canada at the age of 23 and assumed before I got there that it would be no new thing for me. It would be a new land, but I felt sure that I knew the language, that I would understand the culture and the society because that was the way I had been brought up in India. But then incompleteness turned around and I became aware of the loss of my home. So perhaps this sense of loss of his home, this sense of loss that Mistry talks about is what drives him to write this story that we are going to take up for an analysis today. This sense of the loss of his home is present in the central character, the protagonist. His name is Kersey Boyce and he is the narrator of the story. So this sense of loss of his home is very crucial to understand. Now, before I go on to the short story and its critical analysis, I would like to show you the first edition of the book, and we'll also be discussing certain things related to the entire collection of short stories named Tales of Firozsha Baag. As you can see, this is the very first edition, the Penguin edition that was published by Rohinton Mistry. The title was Tales from Firozsha Baag. On the left you can see the book, the first edition, and on the right you have a portrait of Rohinton Mistry, of the author. Now, it was first published in 1987 and this entire collection of short stories, Tales from Firozsha Baag, it contains 11 stories. And these are the 11 stories that you can see on the screen right now. Auspicious Occasion, One Sunday, The Ghost of Firozsha Baag, Condolences Visit, The Collectors of White Hairs and Cricket, The Paying Guests, Squatter, Lend Me Your Light, Exercisers, and the last and the 11th one is The Swimming Lessons. So, Swimming Lessons, the last and the final story in this collection, Tales from Firozsha Baag. This story describes the immigrant experience of Kersey, the unnamed narrator. He was unnamed in Swimming Lessons, but his name was Kersey Boyce. So, the final and the last story in this collection, it describes the immigrant experience as Kersey was feeling through, as Kersey was going through when he was living in Canada. The earlier stories are about the life of the Parsi community in Bombay. The first 10 stories of this collection is about the life of the Parsi community in Bombay. And the final story is about the Canadian experience of the narrator. Now, this story, as I mentioned, is taken from this entire collection of short stories titled Tales from Firozsha Baag. And talking about the name Firozsha Baag, it's basically a Parsi settlement in Bombay where the narrator had lived as a child. So there are 11 stories and the first 10 stories are set in Bombay, and those first 10 stories talk about the past of the narrator. However, the 11th story, Swimming Lessons, the one that we are going to take up for this lecture today, talks about his experience in Canada. So the narrator, Kersey, is a young Parsi migrant and a former resident of Firozsha Baag, and this story talks about how the narrator left Bombay for Toronto, Canada, and it describes how he deals with the immigrant experience living in an apartment in Don Hills in Toronto. And Rohinton Mistry has indeed won several prizes for Tales of Firozsha Baag. And as I mentioned, he is a big name in contemporary world literature today. And amongst all these 11 short stories, we will be reading the final most short story of the collection titled Swimming Lessons. In short, this story talks about identity and identity formation and how we form our identity in a foreign land. It talks about how one assimilates the foreign elements in their own when they are in a foreign land. So therefore, the story Swimming Lessons is about coming to terms with Canadian society, about coming to terms with the trauma of displacement and nostalgia. In fact, Mistry has brought in a very unique narrative structure in Swimming Lessons. The narrative keeps going back and forth to the past of the narrator and then comes back again to the present. And indeed, as part of a unique literary technique that Mistry has employed, there are two narrative voices in the story. So the narrator, Kersey, he first talks in the first person and he describes how he is living in his apartment and he describes the everyday life at Don Hills. Then interspersed within this narrative is the third person narrative, which describes the parents of the narrators living in Bombay, living in Firozsha Baag, living in the Parsi communities, amidst the Parsi communities. So this third person narration is described in the story in italics. So if you look at any page, if you look at any edition of Rohinton Mistry's Swimming Lessons of the story, you will realize that some lines are mentioned separately from within the narrative in italics. So these lines which are italicized are the third person narrative. It's the third person narration. And it is later toward the end of the story that we get to know that the previous 10 stories in the book, the previous 10 stories which I just discussed a while ago, were all written by narrator himself. And the italicized part of the story is a response to those 10 stories by the parents of the narrator. So here we get to know that the 11th story is the same story that the parents are reading, right? And it is the same story that we too are reading. So there are two stories running concurrently here. The first is the narrator and the second is the third person narrative in italics by the parents of the narrator. So it is kind of, you can say, it's a story within a story, right? So this is a unique style by Mistry, and that is why I have repeatedly mentioned that Mistry is one of the great experimenters. He has experimented with the art of the short story writing and novel writing. So the story Swimming Lessons has an unnamed narrator, a Parsi young man who is a migrant in Toronto, and he spent his childhood in Bombay, but now he has migrated to Toronto. His parents, however, are still living in Firozsha Baag. The story tells us about his everyday life in an apartment in Don Hills, but the story is much more than this simplistic explanation, and it goes on to show the identity crisis and the doubts that the immigrant goes through. Now, after this brief introduction, we will turn to the summary of the short story. So, I will be summarizing the short story in the next 5 to 10 minutes, and then we will go on to the critical analysis of the story. So, let us now begin with a quick summary of the story. The story begins at an apartment at Don Hills, and it begins with the description of an old man who is 76 years old and he is wheelchair bound, and he keeps on talking to people in the apartment. He is a very talkative man. The narrator says that this man reminds him of his own grandfather back in India. Next, he describes another person living in the apartment. She is a Portuguese woman and she is extremely talkative and she has most of the gossips around the apartment. The narrative keeps going back and forth, as I mentioned, back and forth again and again in the story, and the narrator takes us back to his childhood from here. And then he describes how his grandfather developed Parkinson's disease. He had osteoporosis, a disease which he mentions that it can be found in good numbers within the Parsi community. He then describes how his grandfather got admitted in the hospital and then he finally dies. Next comes the italicized part of the story. As I mentioned, the italicized part of the story is separate from the first person narrative by the narrator, and this italicized part describes the parents of the narrator back in Bombay. We are told that the son has written a narrative back to his parents in Bombay. And much to the disappointment of the father, the son simply wrote plain information about his life in Canada. He does not tell anything to them in great detail. The son doesn't really tell much about his life in Canada. And here the first italicized part of the narrative ends. Then the story again gets back to the present, and the narrator watches two women who are sunbathing near his apartment. At first he is interested to look at them, but then later on he is disappointed as they get up and come back to the apartment because they don't seem as attractive to them as they did in the beginning. The narrator now goes for his first swimming lessons, and everything that he does remind him of his past in Bombay as a child. He goes for a high school swimming pool as he cannot afford the private swimming clubs in the city, and the swimming pool reminds him of the waters at the Chowpatty beach in Bombay. He describes how the sea used to engulf all sorts of waste, garbage, religious rituals, and even memories from the others. He describes how after the death of the grandfather, his belongings were also thrown into the sea. Then as we progress further into the story, the second italicized part comes, which once again describes, in third person narrative of course, the parents of the narrators back in Bombay. And the parents are writing a letter back to him in Canada, and the father reminds him of his Parsi identity. He reminds him to say his prayers in Canada and to not forget his Parsi identity. The parents are definitely apprehensive, they are nervous with the thought that their son might have forgotten about his Parsi identity in Canada. And here the second italicized part also ends. So once again we are back to the present, to the first person narrative of the narrator in Canada, and we are then described about Berthe, a woman she is the superintendent of the building, and she is described as a Yugoslavian woman, and this was also informed to him by the Portuguese woman, the PW, which we mentioned earlier on. So here the first part of the story ends. Now begins the second part of the story, and at the swimming pool, the narrator describes how he is terrified of the swimming pool. He also encounters a racist remark made by three young boys who laugh and make fun of Kersey's Asian personality, and they make crude racist jokes on him. Then he goes for his swimming classes, and then there he meets his instructor Ron, and the narrator volunteers for the demonstration of paddling, and at the end he miserably ends up gulping big amounts of water. After a few more classes, he simply blames his teacher Ron and decides to discontinue coming to the pool altogether. Then comes the third italicized part, where the son, Kersey, the narrator, he sends a parcel back to his parents in Firozsha Baag, and this contains the stories that he has written in Canada. And here we get to know that the narrator has become a story writer in Canada. And here the third italicized part also ends. The narrative then once again comes back to the present, and it describes the old man, the same old man that reminds the narrator of his grandfather. So he is going to the hospital with his daughter. And then the parents get to know. So now the fourth italicized part begins, and in this the parents get to know that all the stories that the son has sent till now are about Bombay, are about his childhood. The father concludes that their son has memories of his home, and that is why he writes about his old life as a child in Bombay. Then the narrator describes the harsh winters of Canada and describes the snowfall there. Then comes the PW, and the PW, the Portuguese woman, is his constant source of information. He tells him that the old man has suffered a stroke and now he is admitted to the hospital. Then the fifth italicized part begins. The parents get to read all the stories that he has sent to Firozsha Baag in a parcel in the previous part, and they are disappointed that they all contain the description of his life as a child and only talks about his Parsi experience in Bombay, and they do not tell him anything about his Canadian experience. The father is upset, definitely he will be upset, that the characters in all of his stories are just about the pains and problems of middle or lower class Parsi people. He says that there are definitely a lot of positive aspects to Parsi culture, but their son does not write about them. He does not describe in any detail about the rich culture, the history of Parsis from the days of Islamic persecution in the 7th century till their settlement in Bombay in the 20th century. But the mother, she is happy that at least her son remembers everything about his childhood days. Then the father goes into several theories of writing stories. He says that their son writes about Firozsha Baag because he is still not accustomed and assimilated into the Canadian culture. The father also says that now in Canada, he can think of and relook at the past in an objective manner. So the father is interested in theory of writing, but the mother is more interested in this story. And here the fifth italicized part ends, and now the story gets back to the first person narrative in Toronto. So basically, the parents in that italicized part, the parents have read all the stories that their son has written, and here we get to know, in the next italicized part, we get to know that the last story, the final 11th story that the son has written, talks a lot about Canada and describes his day-to-day life in his apartment. The story again gets back to the first person narrative in the house of the narrator. He goes to take a bath in his bathtub and dunks himself in the water. He opens his eyes and sees inside the water, which make him see things in a new and a fresh light. He then decides to get back to the swimming lessons again. So this bathtub episode is the turning point in the life of Kersey, as he finally decides to open up and talk to people. He tries to know, after getting out, he tries to know the name of the old man, and as soon as he reaches downstairs, he gets to know that the old man has died. And here the seventh and the final italicized part of the story begins. And in this part, the mother back in Firozsha Baag is happy to know that the son remembers his grandfather. The father, on the other hand, once again he gets into the theories of writing and surmises what and how his son got prompted to write the stories. So finally the parents decide to write a letter back to their son in Canada and are expecting him to write more stories to send them back in Firozsha Baag. And here the seventh italicized part ends, and the story also ends. So this in brief was the summary of the entire story, Swimming Lessons. So now after this brief summary, now I will get into the more important part of the lecture, and that is a thematic reading of the text. So what I will be doing is, I will be discussing this entire text in a theme based manner, and then we will also be engaged in a close reading of the story, and in a holistic manner we will try to unravel the various symbols, the tropes, the cultural meanings, and will dwell upon the various themes that Mistry puts in the story. So as we know, the story begins with the old man in the apartment, and his name is not mentioned, but he reminds him of his grandfather. So what we get to understand here is that the past constantly gets back to him right from the beginning of the story. The first person who reminds him of his past is the grandfather, is the old man, and it reminds him of his grandfather back in Firozsha Baag. So when he goes to Toronto, the only image that comes to his mind is from his past, from his childhood. The past reminds him of what he was. His memories remind him of his life in Firozsha Baag. So the story is basically it's a way for him, you can say that it's a way for him to deal with his past and his present both. Similarly, later on he gets reminded of the Chowpatty beach from his childhood. The narrative keeps going back and forth, and the distant past is something which comes back again and again in the present life of the narrator. So nostalgia, this means that nostalgia is an important theme in the story. Most of the things that he sees around Canada is in some way or the other connected to his past. The first is, in this case, is the old man who was living in the same apartment as Kersey. He reminds him of his grandfather and his memories of his grandfather. The second thing which reminds him of his past is the sea, the water in the swimming pool, which reminds him of the Chowpatty waters in Bombay. So the water in the swimming pool in Canada reminds him of his sea, of the sea back in Bombay, the Chowpatty waters. Then comes the other story, the italicized part of the story, which is written in italics. This is basically done so that Mistry may show it separate from the main story. And this italicized part, as already discussed, shows the parents in Bombay responding to the stories written by the narrator that he sends to them from Toronto. We are here told that the narrator writes back to his parents in Bombay, but he does not tell them much about what is going on in his life in Canada. He merely tells them about the weather in Toronto, and the father gets upset about it. He says that he can watch the news bulletin if he just wants to know about the weather, but he is upset that he does not share much about his Canadian experience. So we realize, what does this mean? This means that Kersey is still living in the past despite being in a foreign land in Toronto in Canada for around 2 years now. Then the story comes back to the narrator describing two women who are semi-naked and they are lying down for a sunbath near the apartment, and this is a very significant episode as it gives a completely new meaning to the story. The narrator is looking at two sunbathing women from his apartment and he is deriving voyeuristic pleasures out of it. And he looks at these two women from a distance from his apartment, but very soon as they get up, earlier on he was looking at them from a distance, but when they get up and he gets a chance to look at them from close, he surprisingly gets upset about it. Now, why did I say that this is a very significant episode? What is the significance of this episode? Why does he get upset on it? Is it just, is it just the ramblings and rants of a man who first finds a woman sexually attractive but then later does not? What does this mean? Or can it mean something else too? The reality is that from a distance, the women looked attractive to him, but when they come close, they see that they are not really good looking and they are physically not attractive. Actually, this is a potent metaphor for the immigrant experience. It is a metaphor for the immigrant experience. For an immigrant, the thought of living in a foreign country in Canada, far removed from the typical Indian sphere, is an amazing thing. So the thought is brilliant. But when he looks at it closely, and now when the author goes to Canada and visits it closely, he feels the cultural disconnect. The two women represent the metaphor for the immigrant experience. The immigrant experience, which seem attractive in the beginning, which seem attractive from a distance, but upon close reading, upon close analysis, it doesn't look as attractive as it appeared earlier on. So perhaps the failed expectation is not just based on the physical aspects of those two women, but most importantly and very significantly, the failed expectations are based on the cultural aspects of Canada and India. Things do not look as attractive from a close look as they did earlier on. Perhaps Mistry is hinting at the immigrant experience, where things appear attractive from a distance, but not so when looked at from a close angle. Now, very shortly after this episode, as you can look on the slide, as you can see on the slide, very shortly after this episode, the narrator says, "Water imagery in my life is recurring. Chowpatty Beach, now the high school swimming pool. The universal symbol of life and regeneration did nothing but frustrate me. Perhaps the swimming pool will overturn that failure." So the narrator compares the beach in Firozsha Baag in Bombay with the private swimming pool. And why does the narrator opt for a swimming pool only? The reason is that he wanted to assimilate himself into the new Canadian society, and he looked at the swimming pool as a place where the entire community meets. It is a common place, and perhaps it will allow him to get familiar with his surroundings. The swimming pool is a community place where everyone is in the same waters, as the saying also goes, being in the same waters. So being in a swimming pool means being in the same waters as everyone else, and the swimming pool allows him to be in tandem with the Canadian culture, to be in the same waters as the Canadians. But was he successful? Was he able to swim in the same waters? We will find out shortly towards the end of the story. But nonetheless, let's get back to the story. The same question emerges again in front of us. Why the swimming pool only? Why not any other community place? Why only a swimming pool? Because water reminds him of his past. This is the reason. Water reminds him of his childhood days at Chowpatty Beach, and it brings back his memories of his long gone childhood. So as the narrator says, the narrator then further says, as you can look on the screen now, water imagery in my life is recurring. So basically the Chowpatty waters form an integral part of his childhood as well as his Parsi identity. And as the narrator further comments, as you can see on the screen, on the slide, what happens when on the page of life itself one encounters the ever moving, all engirdling sprawl of the filthy sea? Now this comment by the narrator is, I think it's very important, it's a very significant comment. This clearly indicates that the story is in some way or the other about the past of the narrator. If you look at those lines, it clearly indicates that the story is in some way or the other about the past of the narrator. This is why reference to the filthy sea of Bombay, and this is why he refers it to the page of life. The Chowpatty beach episode is also significant for the readers to understand because the narrator dwells on the idea of the sea. The sea in the memory of the narrator is a place of religious congregations. The sea becomes a repository of garbage, sewage and even religious stuff in Bombay. He describes how Parsis used to throw old photographs into the sea, which makes the sea as a repository of memories. And swimming lessons is a lot about memory and how the past comes back to a person. He even says at one point that after the grandfather dies, so all his belongings were thrown into the sea. So the sea and the water includes everything in it. The sea water is something which has space for everything. It engulfs everything, even memories. It has space for garbage, for photographs, for religious congregation, and it also has space for things which are neither religious nor cultural but even personal, like memories in the case of the narrator. So therefore water as a symbol is a symbol of life in the story. So once again from here we will go back to the narrative which shifts back to the parents in Bombay. The parents are about to write a letter to Kersey, and in the letter we notice how the parents are concerned about their son's religious identity. Look at this quote now, as you can see on the screen. Remind him that he is a Zoroastrian, Manashni, Gavashni, Kunashni. Better write the translation also. Good thoughts, good words, good deeds. He must have forgotten what it means, and tell him to say prayers and do kushti at least twice a day. So we notice that the parents only remind him of aspects of Parsi culture. They are sad because they think their son is not able to connect with it and are worried about him losing his Parsi identity there. On the contrary, the son is not able to get out of his comfort zone in Canada. He is not able to assimilate himself in the Canadian culture. As you can look on the screen, as the story goes forward, the narrator writes, "It was hopeless, my first swimming lesson. The water terrified me. I used to love splashing at Chowpatty, carried about by the waves. Where did all this terror come from? I am trying to remember." Now what is this terror that he is talking about? The terror is of dislocation. Because he is coming from Bombay to Canada, the terror therefore is of dislocation. He was not afraid of the dirty, filthy waters of Chowpatty, but he is terrified of the clean, clear waters of the swimming pool. So this is the terror of dislocation, because he is not assimilated in the Canadian society till now. And that is why he was comfortable in the sea waters of Chowpatty, but not in the clear swimming pool because of his dislocation. He blames it on his instructor Ron and says that he is racist, but deep down he knows that he is afraid to go to the swimming pool because he is shy and he is conscious about his own identity. So then the story goes back to the parents living in Bombay. The narrator has sent a parcel to his parents, and this contains various short stories that he has written from Canada. As you can look on the screen now, the father gets upset here, and Mistry writes, in the stories that he has read so far, he has said all the Parsi families which were poor or middle class, but that was okay. There should have been something positive about Parsis as well. My hope is, father said, that there will be some story based on the Canadian experience. That way we will know something about our son's life there. I am quoting it from the story. So the parents were upset that the stories were more about Parsi experience and not about his life in Canada. And here we get to know that the stories that the parents read so far were the same 10 stories in this volume of book, Tales from Firozsha Baag. The 10 stories were about the Parsi experience. This is because for Kersey, his experience as a Parsi is more significant, and he has nothing to share about Canada with his parents. This is because he is dislocated and not in closeness with Canada, and he has no cultural affiliation nor experiential association with his new life in Canada. He just talks about his past, and he has nothing significant to give back to his parents in the last 10 stories. So here we'll end the lecture. This was the first part of the lecture. Very shortly we'll begin with the second part of the lecture, and we'll delve more into the critical analysis and the thematic analysis of the story. Thank you so much.